this is Anugrah Rao. Welcome to the third episode of Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving skills of people and their employability. Now, let me tell you more about Microsoft Art of Code. Microsoft Art of Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technologies, topics related to programming, and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. As you know, we are learning fundamentals of HTML5 and CSS3. This is the third episode of this course. This course is basically for people pursuing computer science, and those who are interested in coding, app development, etc. can join us as well. A basic understanding of HTML, CSS and design is essential if you want to go any further on the web. These episodes have everything you need to upgrade your skills. As we already told you that these courses are not only beneficial for students but also for working professionals. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. We have Bob Tabor from Microsoft, who is an expert in HTML and CSS with us. He is going to talk about everything you need to know about HTML5 and CSS3. But before we start, you need to have a computer system with a 64-bit processor or 32-bit processor. Other required tools are Windows Notepad and any web browser, such as Internet Explorer. Now, let's move towards the course. In the previous episodes, we covered series introduction, creating HTML5 web page, styling HTML5 web page with CSS3, and understanding the HTML5. Now, in this episode, we will learn working with paragraphs and texts, in which we will cover coding part, relative path, global attributes, and semantic names for classes. So let's get started.
Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to take a quick tour of many of the HTML elements that are associated with defining paragraphs and giving semantic meaning to runs of text. So as we're getting started, it's important to remember what I said earlier. Even though your tendency might be to think about the presentation, or in other words, the aesthetics of the web page, you need to think about HTML in terms of semantics. In the case of paragraphs and text, it's the difference of thinking about a particular run of text in a paragraph as being important rather than merely bold or underlined. Do you see the difference there? In one case, I'm thinking about the intent of the run of text. It's important. In the other, I'm thinking about its formatting, its presentation. So therein lies the key difference. The same would be true when we use paragraphs in lesson number 2. You might recall that I had this running dialogue with myself. In fact, let's go ahead and take a look. I have it right here. Let's look at the after folder. And I was specifically talking to myself about this section here. We have a paragraph defined here, and then another paragraph defined right here, where we're including some URLs or IP addresses. And the internal dialogue I had as I was vocalizing it was that I really wanted to put a paragraph kind of to surround all of these things, but yet I needed this vertical spacing so that conventionally it would look correct on a web page. So the way I solved it was to use a paragraph around all the highlighted text you see there, but then to use line breaks because that's the semantic purpose of the line break. So I hope you see the difference there in my way of thinking. I'm looking at the structure of the content merely in terms of vertical spacing versus about thinking about things as complete thoughts. And the complete thought argument won out, and that's why I wrapped the paragraph around the entire complete thought and then used the line breaks conventionally to add some spacing in between. You see? So I'm keeping thematically complete ideas together as one unit. All right, so once you get that distinction down, moving from merely presentation onto semantics, it'll become easier and easier to understand the purpose of each of the elements that we look at in the specification. So I want you to recall from the previous videos, the last video, that we were looking at the specification here. We're looking at the version of the specification called HTML5 Edition for Web Authors. It's draft 29, created in March 2012. You might have access to a newer version of it. That's great. The changes will probably be nominal. You can still follow along with what I'm doing, all right? And I encourage you to do that. But if you scroll down on this document, there will be a table of contents, and it's a pretty intense a table of contents with a lot of level of indentation, which is awesome. So the way that I choose to use this is to, in Internet Explorer, hit Control F on my keyboard to open up the Find toolbar, and then I can search, for example, the strong element, and that'll lead to the link that I can right-click and select Open a New Tag, specifically talking about the strong element as we address that in that section of the video. So now I can learn about its definition and see some examples of strong in use. And we'll come back to strong in just a little bit. This was just a quick example. That's how I'm going to use it. I'm going to right-click on each of these individual items in order to learn more about them. And we'll use that as a style of walking through each of the tags that we're going to cover in the next 4, 5, 6 lessons. Okay? So as we get started, please note that I'm merely going to show you what I consider to be the most important elements with respect to paragraphs and giving semantic meaning to runs of text. We've already seen some of these in action from lesson number 2. Some of them are going to be completely new, but in all cases I'm going to show you basically just a subset of all of the possible elements that you could add when defining paragraphs and text within your HTML5 documents. The key takeaway here is that I'm constantly pointing you towards the specification so that we can use the correct element given its intended semantic purpose inside of our document. All right, that's always the key for us. Okay, so let's start with the basics. Remember, you want to use Control F in the find bar, and what we're going to do is look for the word paragraphs. That should lead you to 3.2.5.3 entitled paragraphs. I'm going to open that in a new tab, and we just want to understand what is meant when we use the term paragraph. And the definition here is great. That's why I wanted to start here. A paragraph is typically a run of phrase and content that forms a block of text with one or more sentences that discuss a particular topic, as in typography, but can also be used for more general thematic grouping. For instance, an address is also a paragraph, as is a part of a form, a byline, or a stanza in a poem. And we'll see good examples of each of these in just a moment. In fact, let's do this. Let's get rid of that and go back to our table of contents, Control F, the P element, where we'll see some good examples of the paragraph tag in use. Alright, so here are some good examples. We can see a traditional paragraph, a couple of sentences kept together like we would read in a book or a magazine article. Alright, but then we can also see the use of a paragraph in the creation of a form which we would use to collect information from a user. One paragraph for the name, one paragraph for the address. All right, so we're keeping these collected but thematically separate from each other. Even though they're two fields in the same form, they're still separate fields. All right, the same is true of a poem. Here we have a stanza of a given poem defined by an opening and closing P paragraph tag, and then for each of the individual lines of the poem we're merely using the line break tag, which we'll get to in just a little bit, so let's hold on to that thought. And then we have some uses and abuses, some examples, and that's very helpful. But structurally, the paragraph tag represents a complete thought, a grouping of sentences or ideas together, but the specification also uses a typography term, a run of phrasing content. It also uses the word thematic, indicating that it can be used beyond a simple textual paragraph, as we saw some examples of just a moment. And we'll see another one of an address here in a little bit. So that brings us to the next idea, which is the line break tag, or the BR element. All right, and I'm going to right click and select open a new tab, and you can see the BR element represents a line break. And let's see, if we need a break in the thought of a given paragraph and yet the break is merely conventional, in nature, then we can use the line break. And a great example of this is a address. We already saw that a paragraph can be used to define an address, but here we see an address created, and by convention we use these BR elements, the line breaks, because that's how we normally visually see an address. Even though it's still one complete thematic thought, we still use these tags to split it up into their own vertical lines, because conventionally that's how we use it. And then below that, it gives us some correct uses and abuses of the BR element. So just to recap, addresses in poetry represent good uses, while using it to separate thematically new thoughts is wrong, because this is the domain of the paragraph element. Now, I just finished saying don't worry about presentation. However, it's hard to ignore the default formatting of the paragraph tag. We saw it just a moment ago when we were looking at the work that we did in lesson number 2. The default style sheet will give essentially one carriage return for a line break item, and 2 carriage returns for a paragraph tag. But that's in this particular odd instance, that's what the BR is used for. It's used to create a single carriage return, essentially, to give some visual separation. So some of these tags kind of cross between visual and semantic, but that's still the semantic value of it, the purpose of it. Okay, let's move on. Talk about formatting the text itself, giving semantic meaning to the text. And so to do that, let's start with the strong element. And I see it right here, so I'm just going to right click it, but you could type in the strong element into the find and then open it in a new tab. And you can see the strong element represents strong importance for its content, like a warning message, for example. Now, that's in contrast to, if we take a look, let's look at the B element and open that up in its own tab. And the B element represents a span of text to which attention is being drawn for utilitarian purposes without conveying any extra importance, and with no implication of alternate voice or mood, such as keywords in a document abstract, product names in a review, actionable words in an interactive text-driven software, or an article lead. Now, the only reason why I bring this up is because there's some confusion between strong and the B element with previous versions of HTML. I think there is now a clear semantic difference between the two. With strong, you are indicating that this text has strong importance. With the B element, it's text that you want to draw attention to. Again, in previous versions, it indicated that you wanted the text to be bold, the B tag. However, for that, you should be using strong for that purpose, semantically. Now, the B element merely means that you're pointing out or highlighting those words, but not saying they're important necessarily. And honestly, that's a difficult distinction to make, in my opinion, so I would probably not use the B element as often, preferring other tags that are more suitable for this purpose. But I think the good example of this is where they're using a first paragraph, or the first part of a paragraph, and indicating this as the lead, using a class, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to say that while this text doesn't have importance like a warning message, it does serve a purpose within this paragraph. In this article, it might be, the byline for the headline. Okay? So let's go ahead and move on and talk about some other markup elements. We're going to look at the mark element, and right click and open that in a new tab. And so the mark element, it indicates a run of text highlighted or marked for reference purposes. So a good example is whenever you're presenting search results on a search results page, you can show the occurrences of the word that was being searched for in line, and then using cascading style sheets, you can highlight that using a background color of yellow or something to call that out. Or you can mark a run of text that you want to call attention to, and will explain or describe later in the section. Alright, so that's the purpose of mark. Then there's the MEM element. and this indicates a word or a phrase of emphasis when you read it, where changing the emphasis changes the meaning of the sentence. This doesn't necessarily indicate the importance of that phrase or that word, just the way that you say it. You might be thinking this is similar to italicizing, however, there's a slight semantic difference between the M and the I element. So let's open up the I element, which traditionally in the past and previous versions of HTML indicated italicizing. In HTML5, however, the I element represents a term that has a special voice or mood, or in some way is offset from the rest of the text. The specification here gives the example of using the I element around a run of text indicating a technical term, and it gives another example. So in this case, look here, here's the technical term. In this other, it gives an example of wrapping it around a dream sequence inside of a short story, okay? And I bring these up, the EM and the I, because the I element was used in previous versions of HTML for presentational purposes to represent italicized text. But in HTML5, using the I element merely for italicizing some text is a semantic no-no. If you want that to be italicized in the sense that you want it to be read in a different voice or it has some ironic meaning, you would probably choose the EM element instead. All right, so let's go ahead and get rid of these two and move on to the U element. And the U element is used for unarticulated text. It indicates a run of text that you want to call attention to because it's misspelled or it has some strange characters due to its rendering from another language. This is kind of a tough one to describe. I'm only going to call attention to it because its meaning has changed from previous versions of HTML where it was used for presentational purposes. You used to use the U element if you wanted something underlined. In HTML5, again, that is a semantic no-no. You would use purely cascading style sheets for that purpose. Now you use the U element for unarticulated text that you can see for marking stress emphasis. The EM element should be used for marking keywords. The B element or the mark element should be used depending on the context. You can use the cite element, but don't use the U element for any of those. Instead, you can use it for text being a proper name in Chinese text, so a Chinese proper name mark, or labeling the text as being misspelled. All right, so that's its true purpose. All right, let's move on from there and talk about the small element. And a lot of what I'm doing, you'll notice here, is I'm trying to correct maybe changes in previous versions of HTML and what that given element means today in HTML5. So if you haven't ever used HTML in the past, maybe this isn't so important to you, but it would definitely be an eye-opener if you're hearing this for the first time coming from previous versions of HTML. All right, let's talk about the small element. Think small print, like in those car ad commercials, or some text run that's a disclaimer or a caveat or a legal restriction or even a copyright. Just to be clear, just because it uses the word small doesn't mean that it has to be presented using a small font. Again, think of the meaning of the term, not the presentation. That presentation is the job of cascading style sheets. All right? So we're going to compare that to, or I'm sorry, just let's move on to the S element, which used to mean strike through, but it has a new representation today. It's a run of text that's no longer accurate, but it's left in the document for reference purposes. Now, let me see. Yeah, here's a good example at the bottom of this page. You'll see that here's an ad, buy our iced tea and lemonade. And then we have an S tag that wraps around this text. Recommended retail price is $3.99 per bottle. That is no longer valid, but it's left in for reference purposes. Now we're selling it for just $2.99 a bottle. All right, and in the past you would use this to put a line, horizontal line through the text, but that's not necessarily what it's used for. Again, that's thinking presentationally. We want to think semantically, that this is information that's no longer valid, but we're leaving in for reference purposes. Okay. So let's contrast the S element to the DEL element, and you can see that moves way deeper in our outline, our table of contents, to something called edits, and that is the fundamental difference between using S for strike through and DEL for strike through. DEL indicates that the content is marked for removal. So the example they provide is to mark a run of text in a to-do list as complete. So you might mark that with DEL, the DEL element, and then later on style that text with a strike through. So if you've ever used like an online to-do list, like 37 Signals applications, typically like Backpack or Basecamp, they have to-do lists, and when you put a check mark in one of the check boxes, it'll put a line through. That would be a good example of the use of the DEL keyword. That could then, that presentationally means like you finished that item, and then you could use CSS to add a strike through or a horizontal line through that entire line that you've completed. All right, so that's the difference between the S and the DEL elements. And like I said a moment ago, the DEL element really belongs in a separate section of the specification called editing, like we saw back here. It's used for web applications and content management systems. However, I added here because of its similarity to the S element, like I said a moment ago. All right, moving on, let's talk about the cite element, C-I-T-E. And so if you're working on technical papers or a research paper, you might want to use the cite element. Let's open that up in a new tab. And so the cite element represents the title of a work, a book, a paper, an essay, a poem, a score, and so on. This can be a work that's being quoted or referenced in detail. So you use this to identify the title of a work that's being quoted, perhaps in a nearby block quote section. And you can see some examples of this, I believe, here. Well, they don't have a block quote here. But you can see how we're citing specific books, comics, tracks from albums, and so on. Here we are citing a Wikipedia article. All right, so it needs to be used in conjunction with perhaps a block quote. So let's look at that. Let's close that up, and we're going to see a more complete example here. And so the block quote is a grouping element used for quotations from another source. Let's scroll down to find the one that has a good cite in it. There we go. So you would then often cite the source inside of the block quote using the cite element that we just looked at a moment ago. The cite can also be used outside of the block quote to call the user's attention to the block quote from, say, a paragraph. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Take a look at this example. Here we're citing Sonnet 130 and then using the block quote element with a cite property or attribute set to where we pulled this from originally, a web page on some fictitious example, all right, where we have then the actual sonnet being quoted in the block quote, all right? And so again, here's another example of a block quote. Then in the caption of that block quote, we're citing the specific articles and citing the magazine or the professional publication where it was originally published. All right, so just keep in mind that block quote and cite sometimes work together and are used whenever you need to reference in a more professional context other websites, documents, books, music, whatever the case might be from around the world. Okay. All right, and then let's move on to the code element. And that kind of takes us in a whole other direction. And you can see the code element represents a fragment of computer code. And so a good example of this as we scroll down is this section here where we are defining a run of text as code, specifically code, and we're going to use the class element to say that this is Pascal programming language. Now this is optional, and there is nothing here that would prevent us from putting any language, even something that's not really a programming language. This is probably more for presentational purposes, to format this different than, say, C# or C++ or Visual Basic Code. Okay, but at any rate, we're using this this element, code element, again around a run of text to indicate its semantic meaning, that this is code and it should be interpreted as such for presentation purposes. There's also this pre-tag, which we're going to ignore mostly for now. It's used to essentially maintain the indentation levels, for example, the amount of individual spaces, the fact that this is returned, because otherwise HTML would not pay any attention to white space, carriage returns, and things of that nature. But we're not going to look into that any further in this lesson, at least. Okay? Okay, so let's now take a break and move on from there. And I want to talk about the anchor tag. It's a big deal in web development, and so it's important that you know how it works because it has quite a few options. You use the anchor tag to create hyperlinks within your document, and we've used hyperlinks all along, even in this lesson where we see these are all hyperlinks. As I hover my mouse cursor over, notice that the URLs are changing near the bottom left-hand corner of my web browser. All right, and you know how hyperlinks work. You've used them probably to get to this very video or web page where you're watching this video. There's a whole section of the specification that are devoted to defining anchors or hyperlinks in your document, and I'm going to distill it down to just the basics so that we can move through this material pretty quickly. The good news is that this is a great opportunity for you to get your hands dirty in writing some code. So what you should do at this point is download the code that's associated with this video. Inside of that zip file there will be a folder called Lesson 05, and inside of Lesson 05 there's a before, a work folder, and an after folder. What I want to do is copy everything inside of the before folder, and I'm going to paste it in the work folder, and here's where I'm going to do all my work. So I'm going to open up lesson05.html in Notepad using any technique that's familiar. And if I were to just open this page up in Internet Explorer by double clicking, you can see there's just a lot of thick text with some H1 tags defining I'm at the top, or I'm sorry, I'm at the bottom, and then anchor tags. And we're going to add some anchor tags right here, and we'll talk about this thick text a little bit later. But for now, let's do this. I want to start with a really simple scenario, and I'm going to add a link to Bing.com. And to do that, I'm going to start with just creating a paragraph, and inside of that I'm going to define an anchor tag, an opening and closing anchor tag, and inside of that I'm going to give a href attribute. I'm going to set it equal to the URL of www.bing.com, and then between the opening and closing anchor tag I will insert any text that I want the user to be able to click on, in this case to Bing. And so let's save this and then open it up in Internet Explorer, and you can see I get a hyperlink that says to Bing beneath my anchor tag H1 here at the very top and my thick text below it. When I click on that, it opens up Bing.com in my web browser. Awesome. Alright, so what I've done here is I've defined what's called an absolute URL, where I'm including the full http://. I'm also including all the first level, second level, and third level domain name. Alright, there's also the idea of a relative URL. So in this case, let's create a reference to another page. In fact, this page will be just another.html, which is akin, I guess you would say, it is a sibling to the lesson05.html page inside of the same folder. And so to create this relative URL, I'm going to start with the opening and closing anchor tag, and then href equals, and then I'm merely going to use the name another.html. And then here inside of, or between the opening and closing anchor tag, I'll just type in another HTML page, like so. Save this. Now let's go back and refresh our page. You can see we get this link to another HTML page. When I click on that, it opens up the another.html page. It's in the same folder as my lesson05.html page, and I merely added before I recorded this video, I created that page, added the link back to this lesson05.html page, so we're able to return here using a return hyperlink. Great. There's a bit more to this story. If you take a look at this folder where I'm doing all my work, the lesson05.html page that I'm currently typing in, we've already looked at another.html. There's also a subfolder called subfolder, and inside of the subfolder there's a subfolder.html page. So what if I wanted to create a relative hyperlink from this page to the page that's inside of my subfolder? Well, to do that, let's go ahead and add another paragraph tag, and then inside that href equals, and here I'm just going to type in the word subfolder, since that's the name of my subfolder, slash then the name of the file that I want to reference, subfolder.html. And here I'm going to type to the subfolder HTML page. And let's save that, and let's refresh this page, and then now let's click on our new hyperlink, and it takes us to, you'll notice, lesson05/work/subfolder/subfolder.html. Awesome. Now what if I wanted to return back from this page to the parent directory? How would I go about doing that? Well, you can see I've already created that hyperlink, and it brings us back. Let's take a look at the code that I wrote to make this happen. Let's open this with Notepad, and you can see that in this case I use this special notation, .. which means go to the parent directory, at which point you'll find a file named lesson05.html. So whenever you see ... and /, it means go to the parent directory to find the given resource, in this case the HTML page. Alright? And we're going to come back to this notion in just a little bit. We'll talk about relative URLs and give a quick overview before we finish up. But one thing I wanted to show you is that up to this point in our page, every time I click on the to Bing hyperlink, it opens the hyperlink in the same tab in the same instance of Internet Explorer. But what if I wanted to open this up either in a new tab or in a whole new window? Well, I can accomplish that by adding an additional attribute called target. And there are a number of different target values that I could put here. The one I'm going to use though is blank, which means open up in a blank window, essentially. Alright? So some of the other ones have things to do with frames, and we're not going to talk about frames in this series of videos. Just note that there are some other options here besides blank. Notice the underscore before the word blank. Okay, make sure you have that. That's important. Let me refresh my web page and then click the to Bing link, and now notice that it opens up a second instance of Internet Explorer. Now that's just how I have my copy of Internet Explorer configured. You can configure it to open new URLs in new tabs in your first instance of Internet Explorer if you wish, and you would just go through, I'm not sure exactly where to do that. I think it's somewhere in Internet Options. You can configure that. I guess it's right here under tabs probably. Alright, but I'm not going to take the time to look through that. Alright, but that's how you would open up, and the benefit of that is that it keeps your user on your page while opening up your references to other web pages that you might have, if that's something that you want to enable. All right, finally what we want to do is talk about named anchors, and that's really the purpose of having all this text. I needed a lot of thick text so that I can create essentially a bookmark, or I can push you deeper down into the web page using a named anchor. So let's go ahead and create a paragraph. Inside the paragraph, create an anchor tag, and inside the anchor tag I'm going to set the href equal to, and I'm going to use a pound symbol and then the word bottom, which will be the name of the anchor I'm creating, and I'm going to use this text to click on to bottom. Now what I want to do is scroll to the very bottom of this document, and where it says I'm at the bottom, I'm going to put another anchor. This time I'm not going to use an href attribute. Instead I'm going to use the name attribute, and I'm going to make sure it matches what I formerly used prior to that in the href, the pound bottom. Now I'm just going to use the word bottom with no pound symbol. So name equals bottom. I'm going to save this, and then let's open up Internet Explorer. Let's refresh this page. I have my to bottom link, and when I click it, notice it pushes me all the way deep down to the very bottom of the web page. So you see a lot of times when you have a long article, there might be a go to the top of the web page hyperlink in the right hand corner, in which case it'll take you all the way to the top. You can enable that type of navigation. We've been using this sort of navigation all along inside of the table of contents. So for example, here I want to get to character encodings. Notice the URL in the very bottom left hand corner. There's an infrastructure.html pound character encodings, so that when I open this in a new tab, it'll bring us not only to the infrastructure.html page, but then it'll push us deep down into that web page to the named anchor character encodings to this, so that we can get specifically to this part of the page. Alright, one other thing before we conclude here. Let me get back and open up our lesson05.html page that we've been working on. Notice that once you've visited a hyperlink, the default style that's applied to those hyperlinks changes the color to purple instead of blue by default. You'll have control over this in Cascading Style Sheets. However, if you want to reset this in Internet Explorer, you'd merely go to the Tools, Internet Options. You would go to Browsing History and click the Delete button, and make sure that you are deleting the history, and then click Delete, and you'll get a little message. Internet Explorer has finished deleting the browsing history. Let's go ahead and click OK, and then close down the browser, so that the next time I open it up, you can see it's reset which links I've already clicked through and which ones I haven't. Again, we can control the colors of the different states of a hyperlink using Cascading Style Sheets, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this series. All right. Okay, so when we refer to external resources in an anchor element or an image element, we need to be aware of path syntax. And we've already looked at this a little bit whenever we were looking at the subfolder a little bit ago. We've already talked about the differences between absolute and relative URLs. So this really is more about referencing relative URLs, because absolute URLs, we would just put the full domain name and all the folders until we get to the actual resource, whether that's a GIF file, an HTML page, or whatever the case might be. So if we wanted to reference something else in our href, for example, of our anchor tag, we would use and that resource was in the same directory as our web page, we can merely reference it like so, a.gif. If that file was in a parent directory, we could use the .. notation that we talked about just a few moments ago. If the given resource is in a subdirectory called images, then we would use images/a.gif. And we saw this whenever we were referencing the subfolder, where we use subfolder/subfolder.html. Okay. But what if the images folder was, I guess, at the same level, a sibling to the current folder that we're in? So then first we need to travel to the parent directory, then travel to its subdirectory called images to find the a.gif. So that's what's represented in that /images/a.gif. And then finally, what if the images folder was deeply nested, and so we have to go to the parent of the parent folder and then find the images subfolder where our images are stored. In that case, we could do // images / a.gif. Okay? All right, so admittedly, this can get quite convoluted. So why not just use an absolute URL reference every single time instead of a relative URL and have to contend with all these navigating back and forth through the directory structure like we've been doing? Well, if the website should ever move, you'd simply need to keep the relative directory structure the same at the new server or location relative to the directory structure, and the same references are still valid in that case. You might think you might never need that, but if you're developing a website locally and then you move it to a server at some point, you'll quickly see the value of using relative paths over fixed or absolute paths. All right. Also, when it comes to the URL itself, some characters have special meaning or must be encoded in some way so that they're properly routed to the correct resource on the web server. This process is called URL encoding. The best and the most frequent example that you're going to see is whenever somebody has a space in a file name used in a URL. You have to convert that space character to one of two things, either a plus symbol or the %20 ASCII code. The percentage is an escape sequence to indicate that it's an ASCII value, and then the two digits that follow are hexadecimal values that indicate what kind of ASCII character. In this case, we're representing a space character with the 20. Now, there are dozens and dozens that you can find in any reference for URL encodings, but only a handful are really used frequently. So what I'd encourage you to do is just search for the term URL encoding in Bing.com, or check out the Wikipedia article that you see here on the screen for more information about URL encodings. Also, you've already seen the pound symbol used in a URL to indicate an anchor, a named anchor, deep into the body of a web page. Throughout this series, I've pointed you to specific sections on various pages in the HTML specification using the pound symbol. So I might give you a URL like this, and I'm just going to paste it in to the location bar in Internet Explorer. It includes not only the HTML file, but then also a pound symbol. And again, this allows me to deep link inside of the web page to the specific element or item that I want to call your attention to. So, but there's also a way to send name-value pairs in the URL, and that's called a query string. You're going to learn more about query strings whenever you learn ASP.NET as a means of maintaining state or passing values between two web pages. So you're going to see this type of URL often. Take a look at the URL on screen. www.whatever.com/default.aspx. Then there's a question mark, and then a val1 equal hello, and then an ampersand, and a val2 equals world. So let me explain what each of these things are doing. You can pretty much, for the most part, ignore everything up to the question mark with regards to query strings. It's everything after the question mark that is a query string. The question mark clues you into the fact that we're querying, and so everything after that is a query string. And so we have a series of name-value pairs. The name of an attribute or property is, in this case, val1, and we set it equal to some value, hello. And then to designate that we need a second set of name-value pairs, we use an ampersand symbol, and then val2 is the name of the second attribute that we have set a value to, and then equal sign to the value of world. All right. So why you might ever want to do that, again, once you get into more programming topics where you need to pass values from one web page to another, and it might be information that would be then used to look up something in a database, you'll see the value of that. But for now, just note that everything after the question mark is considered a query string, and you'll see those URLs often whenever you're looking throughout the internet. Okay, so that's all I really have to say about URLs and hyperlinks and anchors and the difference between relative and absolute URLs and so on. But this topic will come up again briefly whenever we talk about the source attribute of the image element a little bit later in this series of videos. All right, so the final element that I want to talk about is the span. So let me get back to our table of contents here. and then I'm going to hit Control F on my keyboard and type in the span element, and right click and select Open in New Tab. So it's intended to be used generically, specifying a run of text that really doesn't fit into any of the other elements that we've already mentioned. Now, the truth be told, in previous versions of HTML, you used the span element as a hook into CSS for some inline text that you wanted to format in some special way. Say, for example, you wanted some text to be red. You might wrap it with a span tag and then give it a special class or ID name in order to pluck it out and identify that little chunk of text to have a red font. That's still allowed, but you're strongly encouraged to use one of the other elements first so that the document is marked up semantically, right? So again, if you just use span elements all over the place, you use the rich semantic markup of your document that was intended with HTML5. And so you can see some uses of the span tag throughout this document, and it uses kind of a code example, and it's identifying some items as keywords for the C programming language, some items as I guess identifiers like J, and identifiers like I_T3 and so on. Okay, so that would be the use of the span in this case, where there's no other semantic markup element that would allow you to identify given elements of this code example, some as variables, some as keywords, and so on. And you could mark it up and use text coloring appropriately in that case. All right. Now, using the class attribute, like they use here in the as they demonstrate here in the specification, it does provide you some level of meaning to your span tags. However, since you're the one making up the values in the class attribute, other applications wouldn't be able to interpret that class attribute's value the way that they would be able to interpret HTML5 markup that's defined in the specification. The class attribute is useful for cascading style sheets, but not a screen reader, for example. The screen reader doesn't know what you mean by ident or keyword and so forth. Okay? But if you see other people's code, especially code that's written to target versions prior to HTML5, you'll see this used quite a bit, and as well as its sectioning equivalent, the div tag, and we'll have more to say about the div tag in the next lesson. Okay, finally, before we wrap up this lesson, I want to talk about the attributes that can be added to each HTML5 element. And there are a few global attributes that apply to many elements. Here in this case, I have a span tag. On screen you can see, and there is, first of all, a class attribute equal to storyline, and then an ID equal to first story header. In this case, I have two attributes, a class attribute and an ID attribute. Now, I've used a span tag, but I could have used any element here. What I'm about to show you are global attributes. They can be used on any attribute defined in HTML5. I've added a class and an ID. An ID is typically used as a unique identifier that I can add to each element if I so desire. The ID attribute is typically used for client-side scripting, for example, whenever I use JavaScript, so that I can access one item programmatically. It can also be used with cascading style sheets by referencing just the ID. So the ID attribute is completely optional, but if you do choose to use it, each ID must be unique on a given page. Similar to the ID is the name attribute, which is typically used on the server side to process form data. I'm going to discuss this a little bit in more detail when we get to the lesson on creating forms. It's similar in purpose, but typically it's utilized by our server-side code logic to retrieve a user-submitted value. Let's just table that discussion for right now. Let's talk about global attributes, and to do that, let's be in our table of contents, let's type in global attributes, because if you look at this particular web page inside the specification, it'll give you a list of global attributes that can be applied to virtually any HTML element, as well as others that have some specific uses and intent for handling events. But let's just focus on these at the very top here. The class attribute as you can see, it's one of the global attributes that are available, is a classification of a given element. You can invent as many class values as you wish, and they're typically used by Cascading style sheets as a hook for styling the elements on your web pages. Other software could utilize the class attribute for other purposes. But it's a good idea to keep class names semantically correct as well. So you might be tempted to create a class called red text and then create Cascading style sheet styles that set the appearance of the font to be red. However, a better idea might be to call it something like important message, then style it with a red font if you wish. We'll talk about CSS later, and we'll make sure to re-emphasize this idea. And there are other attributes like style and title that are global in nature, and then there's dozens of attributes that are specific to different types of HTML5 elements, and we'll cover these as needed in the rest of our lessons. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap this up. As you probably noticed, many of the links that I used in this lesson were from this section 4.6 in our table of contents, this text level semantics. We looked at the anchor and the M and the strong and the small and the S and the cite, but we didn't look at things like the Q and the DFN and the ABR and the time and the var and the SAMP and so on. Alright, so there's still a lot of work for you to do on your own. Go through each one of these and make sure you understand, or at least read through, what the semantic value is for these. So when you face a situation where you need to add some semantic markup inside of your paragraphs, you can give them the rich meaning that they deserve with HTML5. Okay? So in the next lesson, we're going to look at structural semantics. It's extremely important. Make sure you watch the next video as well. We'll see you there. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're continuing our look at the various elements available in HTML5. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the heading content and sectioning content. A combination of these will provide structure to our web pages, or rather, they're ways of grouping content on our web page in a semantic manner. The previous lesson merely dealt with paragraphs and runs of text. However, there are larger structural elements in a typical web page that define sections like the header, the navigation area, the footer, and of course the main area. You might be working through this and asking yourself, do I really need these? Do I really need to know all these HTML5 structural elements? And the truth is that we can create web pages without any of these structural elements that we're going to discuss in this lesson. However, a real HTML5 page will contain these because of the reasons that I mentioned a little bit earlier and in previous videos. Leaving them out means that our page is void of semantic structural meaning. These are important as far as HTML5 is concerned, so let's go ahead and dive into them. And we're going to start with heading content, specifically look at H1, H2, H3, and so on. So you can see I'm already starting here on the specification page. If you haven't already, please navigate to it and create a bookmark because we're going to keep coming back to this. And you'll recall from previous videos the technique we use is to hit Control F on our keyboard to bring up the find toolbar, and here I'm going to type in the H1 comma, and that'll get us close enough to this title called the H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6 elements. I'm going to right click and select open in new tab, and these heading elements define the headers of the various sections in our documents. So here we have a series of ranks. H1 is the highest rank and H6 would be the lowest rank. So for example, H1 would be the subject of a section, H2 would be subsections that belong to the H1 section, and so on. So you can think of a hierarchy or kind of an outline where you have up to 6 levels of hierarchy or indentation or whatever, what have you. Okay, actually there's a way to get more than 6 levels with sectioning, but that's kind of an advanced concept and I don't want to talk about it right now. So these are the ways that you describe the various sections that we're going to define using sectioning content elements in just a bit. So I created a really quick example of this. Make sure you download the code from wherever you are currently watching this video or wherever you originally downloaded this video. There should be a zip file that has a folder called Lesson 06. If you open it up, there's just one file in it. And if you double click it, you can see an example of using an H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. We can look at the source for this file, and there's really nothing up my sleeve here. It's fairly simple and straightforward. I think it's interesting to note that by default there's a style sheet applied that makes the H1 a very large font and the H6 a very small font, and each of them in between are various degrees. Okay, but again, you style this using cascading style sheets. You typically never just adopt the default style sheet if you're going for a highly stylized web design. All right, but at any rate, semantically, what we're indicating here is a number of ranks and a hierarchy for our content. Okay, so let me go ahead and close that down and get back into our web browser. So let's talk about sectioning content elements. We use these in lesson number 2, and they're tags like the header. So let me start off by doing this. The header element, and I'm just going to right click and open that in a new tab. Then we're going to type in the footer element, and I'll right click and open that in a new tab, and then also the nav element and open that in a new tab. Alright, so before I discuss what each of these are and why they're important, we need to know that they can be added in any order within our document. In fact, a footer can appear before the header because we're interested in the semantics, not necessarily the order of how these elements appear visually on the web page. If we take a look at the header element here on our page, we can see that the header element represents a group of introductory or navigational aids. So we used it in our example in lesson number 2 as the very topmost section of the web page, but it could be used in other sections on the page if we wanted to indicate that it will contain important information for that given section. So you might think of an example of a blog. You might have a web page that has multiple blog posts on it. It might contain, each of those individual blog posts are contained in a section, and each individual blog post might have a title and author, how many likes it got, buttons to various social networks, and so on. So you might, in that case, have a couple of different headers. One header for each of the blog entries on that given page, and then another header section at the very top of the web page itself. Similarly, we can look at the footer element, and the footer element represents a footer for its nearest ancestor sectioning content or sectioning root element. A footer typically contains information about its section, such as who wrote it, the links related to related documents, copyright data, and the like. So in our example in lesson 2, we used it at the very bottom of the web page. But here again, going back to that blog example I spoke about just a few moments ago, you might have several blog posts on a single page, and you might have for each of the individual blog post sections, you might have a little footer with the date that it was written, the author, the pingback information, the ability to add comments, and so on. And then there's the nav element. And you can see it describes the nav element as represents a section of the page that links to other pages or to parts within the page, a section with navigation links. So we might typically think of the navigation in terms of a menu at the very top of each page of a website and possibly at the very bottom of every page as well. However, if you had links on the page that push the user deeper into the web page, kind of like we have here, with using named anchors and so forth as a form of bookmarks, or any sub-navigation on the page, you would use a nav tag to indicate that regardless of where it appears on the given page or whether it's in a header or footer or not. So we said that these tags, the header, the footer, the nav, can appear in any order. It's relative to their meaning within the given document. Furthermore, they can appear multiple times, again, if it makes sense semantically to do so. So, for example, a page that lists multiple blog posts is a good example of that, where we were able to use, or at least conceive of how we would use the header, the footer, and the nav multiple times on a single web page. But let's not worry about that too much. If we keep our pages simple, this really won't be an issue, at least not right away. But here we can begin to see the value of defining our markup in terms of semantics, so that a screen reader can skip the header, the footer, and the navigation areas and go directly to the main sections, like the articles on a given web page. So next up, let me shut all these down. Let's talk about the article element, and let's talk about the section element. All right, so let's start with the article element. Okay, so when we're thinking about article, we're not simply thinking about like a newspaper article. Instead, we're thinking about something that's a complete unit, a complete idea, something that can be syndicatable. And what do I mean by that? Well, take for example on an e-commerce website, you might have a number of products in a product catalog, a book, a shirt, a dishwasher, whatever the case might be. Each of those products might have a title, a description, an image, a price, and so on, right? And so if you publish these correctly in a way that's consumable by other websites, they can be syndicated on those websites. So for example, a search engine or another website that's like has an affiliate relationship with your website could take the entire definition that you created inside of the article designation, inside of the article specification, and then include it on their own website so that your products come up as items in the search engine, or could be included as in a comparison website. And so this gives a company another avenue through which to sell their products by merely structuring the content for each of their products using articles and making them syndicatable. Okay. The same could be said of a blog post, for that matter, or a news article, or sports scores, or anything that's a complete thought should be marked as an article so that it can be potentially syndicated by others if that is indeed your ultimate intent. Now, the sectioning element, as we see here, there we go, the section element has a different intent. You can see that the section element represents a generic section of a document or application. A section in this context is a thematic grouping of content, typically with a heading. All right, so it is generic in nature, but it generally represents smaller pieces of a larger component. So for example, while an article might be a big picture idea or thought, a series of sections could define individual parts of the article. Now, of course, this is relative. Conversely, a section could contain articles, if that semantically makes sense. Sections can contain other sections. So just like I said about the header, the footer, and the nav appearing multiple times in a document, the same is true with an article and a section. And this might sound crazy, but a section can contain articles that can contain sections, okay? And so at this point, I've created a couple little graphics to help smooth this over. This first image that you see on screen, it closely resembles the layout for the project that we worked on in lesson 02, where we have a section with a couple of articles inside of it. At the very top and bottom we have a header and footer. Each have a nav section inside of it. Okay, so that's a pretty straightforward, and we see how we have a section that contains articles. Let's look at an alternate version of this in a second image here. Our header and footer look exactly the same, but inside of our section in the main area we have an article and then a second article that has some subsections defined inside of it. So in this case we have a section that has an article that contains two sections. Okay, and then let's look at a third example here where we have a header and a footer by themselves, and then a nav section that's not part of the header or the footer. Inside of the main area, it's called the article, and the article has a header and a footer with two subsections inside of it. And there are literally probably no end to the combinations that we come up with. These are just some ideas to kind of illustrate the things that we've been talking about. So the real question at this point is, what is all this accomplishing? Well, it allows a scenario where each article is syndicated to multiple websites and you want to retain the semantic meaning of the headings and the paragraphs and so on. Now, the site compiling the articles might define a different styling, but it can use the entire section in its entirety. Okay, a lot of time is spent on in the specification explaining some of these scenarios, and they're a bit on the advanced side, advanced use cases. But all I'll say about it for now is that each section that you define essentially restarts the hierarchy of headings so that you can have more than just six headers. So for a full understanding of the notion of outlines and how the sections reset the styles associated with the various headings, take a look in our document here at creating an outline, and spend some time reading this over. You never see outlines, but it's just how web browsers are supposed to interpret the scenarios that I just described. And this might help you come to a better understanding of the relationship between sections and headings if you need those for a complex page structure. Okay, so moving on, let's take a look at the aside element. And this is another structural tag that has meaning. It's used to define any part of a document that doesn't belong directly in the paragraphs but supplies some additional information. So it could be skipped over. It might define a marketing message, a pull quote, a did you know section like some books have, or what have you. And if you take a look at this example, you can see the use of the aside for a pull quote. Here we have a paragraph of text and another paragraph of text, and in the middle of it we have an aside defined. And in this case, the aside is merely used to draw the reader's attention deeper into the article, so to provide some visual interest to the article and highlight the most important quotes from the article. All right, so let's move on to the div element. And I mentioned the div element in the previous lesson, saying that it was the sectioning equivalent of the span element, in so much that it has no inherent semantic meaning. So take a look at how it describes this. The div element has no special meaning at all. It represents its children. It can be used with the class, lang, and title attributes to mark up semantics common to a group of consecutive elements. Authors are strongly encouraged to view the div element as an element of last resort, for when no other element is suitable. Use of more appropriate elements instead of the div element leads to better accessibility for readers and easier maintainability for authors. Alright, so we're saying this section of content defined inside of a div tag belongs together, but it really doesn't fall into any of the other semantic containers that we might have available to us in HTML5. Now, that should be rare. However, the div tag was abused in previous versions of HTML. In fact, somebody coined the phrase divitis for web pages that have dozens of div tags defined. The reason people used so many div tags was for page layout. The div provided a way to get some advanced layouts without having to resort to tables for page layout, which is another semantic no-no. However, in doing so, they merely replaced one bad habit with another. So, should you use the div element in HTML5? Well, the specification, as we just read, says that it's the sectioning container of last resort. But practically speaking, I expect we're still going to see a lot of the div tag, because even in the most careful designs, there will always be a trade-off between semantic purity and aesthetics. In other words, to achieve a beautiful page design with drop shadows and rounded corners, dramatic layouts with other neat features, the div tag will be employed as a box around which styling can be applied. So we're going to talk about this more when we get into CSS, but if you look at most web pages on the internet, each will contain many div tags, typically used for styling purposes. So that's kind of the practical nature of web development. Everybody agrees that something is a good idea or a bad idea because it doesn't adhere to a certain ideal, but to get the desired layout, compromises are sometimes made. Okay. All right, so finally, there's an element related to our heading content, but wasn't included as part of the heading or sectioning content model, and that is the H group. Let's take a look at that. So the H group, or the heading group element, represents the heading of a section. The element is used to group a set of H1 through H6 elements when the heading has multiple levels, such as subheadings, alternate titles, or taglines. So the heading group is a new tag that's meant to treat multiple heading tags as a single unit. Sometimes the H1 tag is used for a company name to be displayed besides the logo, and then the H2 is used or intended to be used as the byline or some type of phrase to describe what the company does. In these cases, you can group them all together to be represented as a single entity, not as a hierarchical elements the way that you normally use the H1 and the H2 and so on. And they have a good example of this. You can see here we have an H group where we have a perhaps an article or a book, and then so the book's official title, and then a byline or a secondary title, as you can see it described as here. Okay, so I think I covered most of the elements used for sectioning and heading purposes. I think conceptually the hard part is over. We'll merely add to the elements that we're going to cover for adding things like images and lists and tables and forms and so on. But I want to emphasize that what I talked about in the last two lessons, as well as this lesson, may seem like pretty heady stuff, but honestly, I wouldn't sweat it a whole lot. If you make a mistake and you use the wrong tag, chances are your pages are still going to look correct on most web browsers. The worst that can happen is that semantically, your page loses a little bit of value, a little bit of semantic meaning. We could have just ignored lessons 5 and 6 for the most part, but I think you miss the heart of HTML5 if you skip these new tags that have been added. You might ask, well, what's the purpose for all these tags? Well, hopefully we've been answering what the purpose for all these tags is all along, so that you get a strong sense of meaning and semantics whenever you're thinking of using HTML5. Okay, so like I said, I think the hard part's over. It's all downhill from here, just learning new tags, but hopefully firmly ensconced in your mind is that difference between the semantic meaning and its representation or its aesthetic representation within the web browser. Once you get past that hurdle, it's all pretty easy. Okay, so we're going to continue on the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to talk about adding images and figures to our HTML5 documents. So let's go ahead and start with the image or IMG element. And just to remind you, we're looking at a version of the specification called HTML5 Edition for Web Authors. And I'm just going to scroll down to remind us that we're searching on the table of contents. I'm going to hit Control F on my keyboard to bring up the Find toolbar. I'm going to type in the IMG, and that'll bring us to a section of the table of contents specifically related to the image. Notice that unlike many of the elements that we've looked at up to this point, there's a lot to the image, as we can see clearly from the amount of the indentation levels, the amount of content that is contained inside of the IMG element. But let's go ahead and just open it up in a new tab. You can see there are a number of attributes that are specific to the IMG control, like the alt and the source, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. In its basic form, you simply need the following to define an image. So the IMG source attribute equals, and then the alt attribute equals. So it simply has two requirements: a valid source attribute that points to an image file using a URL, and then an alt attribute which describes the image for those who can't process image or those who have image loading disabled. So here again, a nod to screen reader software for those who have limited or no vision capabilities. The alt value would be read aloud in these cases, describing the content of the image to that person that's visually impaired. There are other optional attributes allowed in HTML5, including a width and a height, for example, allowing you to specify the image's width and height in pixels. Now, here's where the presentation overlaps with semantic meaning. I would recommend that you handle the sizing of your images purely in CSS. However, you're going to see plenty of people defining image elements with width and height, and certainly it is allowed. Sometimes if the image can't be loaded for some reason, an empty placeholder will be represented by kind of a large box with a little icon in the upper left hand corner with a little X through it, and if you have the width and the height, then it will use that to size that empty box appropriately. So there is a pragmatic rationale to their existence, because it might help with the formatting of the rest of the page if you're relying on the size of that image to help format the rest of the page relative to that image. But I still think, despite that advantage, you should opt to keep things semantically clean and keep all your presentation information, including the size of the images, in your cascading style sheets. Okay, and we'll show how to do that much later. Now, with regard to the source attribute, you can set it to any valid URL that resolves to an image file, and the same rules that we talked about in lesson 5 about URLs apply here as well. So I'm not going to take the time to reiterate them. It's common to keep all images in a separate folder for easy management, something like /images or /creative. Just keep in mind then that most likely you'll see something like this whenever you're looking at other people's source code. So src attribute equals images /my.gif, or source equals ... remember that means go to the parent directory, and then the images directory my.gif. Okay? Now, moving on, in some cases we want to use an image in an academic context where it's important to annotate the source or provide a caption and then reference the specific image or textual resource like a table or a quote in a paragraph. In those cases, you can use the figure. So let's go ahead and look at the figure element and open that up. And since I'm right here, I'm going to go ahead and open up the fig caption as well, since we'll talk about that in just a moment. So if you take a look at, first of all, you can see the figure element represents some flow content optionally with a caption that's self-contained. It's typically referenced as a single unit from the main flow of the document. It can be used to annotate illustrations, diagrams, photos, code listings, and so on that are referred to from the main content of the document, but that could, without affecting the flow of the content, be moved away from the primary content. For example, to the side of the page, to dedicated pages, or to an index. All right, and so I think a good example of that, I think they have one here. Okay, so you can see on screen that I have a snippet out of an HTML page with image source equals welcome.jpg, and then I create a fig caption, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But the figure is the collection of the image itself as well as a caption in the fig caption. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. We already had the web page open. You can see the fig caption represents a caption or legend for the rest of the contents of the fig caption element's parent figure element. So basically just a caption or a legend for the contents inside or in the remaining portion of the figure that's apparent to the fig caption. All right, in this case we just happen to have something called a caption for the image, and then I have some small copyright information as well. So a figure is used to include photos, illustrations, code, diagrams, listings, and so on without affecting the flow of the document. It can be moved to its own web page, or it can be moved away from the place where it's referenced. And so if you take a look on this page, you can see in this example another example of where it's used with code. Here we have a figure that includes code, and we have a caption that calls it listing for the primary code interface API declaration. All right, so that's an interesting way to use it. And the fig caption element represents a caption or a legend for the rest of the contents inside the figure, just like we see here. Okay, so besides working with simple images, we also talked about figures and captions in this lesson. Let's keep moving forward. This is a very simple concept. Let's not spend more time on it than we need to. In the next lesson, we're going to work with lists and other groupings of content. We'll see you there. Thank you.
That's all for today's episode. I hope this tutorial was helpful. You can download the entire series code from the links given below. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website www.millionlights.org and post your questions on our forum. We will be really happy to clear all your doubts. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook as well as on Twitter by the name Millionlights. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, keep watching Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Thank you.